It was an ordinary Monday afternoon in early autumn when my world shifted ever so slightly. My husband Mark stood in our kitchen, casually dropping news that made my stomach tighten and my heart race. "They want me to head up the Singapore presentation," he said, stirring his coffee as if he'd just mentioned we needed more milk. His eyes sparkled with excitement, a stark contrast to the dread I felt building inside me. "I'll be gone for a week." A week, the longest we'd been apart since our wedding 3 years ago. I nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes, my mind already racing with all the ways I'd miss him. "That's great, honey. When do you leave?" I managed to ask, my voice steadier than I felt. "Thursday morning," he replied, setting down his mug and pulling me into a hug. His warmth enveloped me, momentarily calming my anxieties. "I know it's sudden, but this could mean big things for us. A promotion, maybe even a transfer to the Singapore office if it goes well." I breathed in his familiar scent, sandalwood cologne and that indefinable something that was just Mark. Our apartment, our little sanctuary in the chaos of the city, would feel so empty without him. I tried to focus on his excitement rather than my apprehension. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations and stolen moments together. Mark packed meticulously, as he did everything in life. Crisp shirts folded with precision, each one chosen for a specific meeting or event. Ties rolled to prevent wrinkles, arranged by color. His passport and travel documents arranged in perfect order in his leather portfolio, a gift from me on our last anniversary. "I'll call every night," he promised, kissing my forehead as we stood at the security checkpoint. The bustle of the airport faded away, leaving just us in our little bubble. "And I'll bring you back something nice. Maybe one of those orchids you love." I watched him disappear through the gate, his confident stride carrying him away from me. My heart ached as if a piece of it was leaving with him. The drive home was quiet, the radio playing songs I didn't really hear, my mind replaying our last moments together. When I pushed open our apartment door, the silence hit me like a physical force. I'd never noticed how much space Mark's presence filled, not just physically, but energetically. The subtle sounds of his existence, his fingers tapping on his laptop, the soft whistle he made while cooking, even the sound of his breathing at night, were all suddenly, glaringly absent. Without him, our home felt like a museum of our life together, rather than a living space. I tried everything to fill the void left by his absence. I buried myself in work spreadsheets until the numbers blurred before my eyes, hoping exhaustion would make the nights easier. I binged shows on Netflix that couldn't hold my attention, the plot seeming trivial compared to the emptiness I felt. I even rearranged the bookshelf, a task I'd been putting off for months, hoping the physical act of organizing would bring some order to my scattered emotions. Nothing helped. The emptiness followed me from room to room like a persistent shadow, a constant reminder of the temporary hole in my life. I found myself talking out loud, sharing thoughts with the Mark-shaped absence, as if I could conjure him back through sheer force of will. Oid. I buried myself in work spreadsheets until the numbers blurred before my eyes. I binged shows on Netflix that couldn't hold my attention. I even rearranged the bookshelf, a task I'd been putting off for months. Nothing helped. The emptiness followed me from room to room like a persistent shadow. By the third evening, I was curled up on our couch with a cup of chamomile tea and a novel I couldn't focus on when the doorbell rang. The sound was so unexpected in the tomb-like quiet that I actually jumped, spilling tea on my sweatpants. Who would be visiting at 8:30 on a Wednesday night? I peered through the peephole and felt a rush of surprise. John, Mark's best friend since college, stood in the hallway, a bottle of wine in one hand. When I opened the door, He greeted me with that easy smile I'd seen countless times at dinner parties and game nights. "Hey, Sarah," he said, holding up the wine. "Mark mentioned he was out of town this week. Thought you might like some company." I hesitated for just a moment before stepping aside to let John in. We'd known each other for years, but always with Mark as our connection point. I realized with a start that we'd never spent time alone together. "You didn't have to do that," I said, suddenly conscious of my messy ponytail and tea-stained sweatpants. "But I'm glad you did." John moved through our apartment with the familiarity of someone who'd been there many times before. He headed straight for the kitchen, found the wine opener in the drawer where it always was, and pulled out 2 glasses from the cabinet. "Rough few days?" he asked, nodding toward the pile of books and magazines scattered across the coffee table. I laughed, the sound surprising me with its genuineness. "Is it that obvious? Mark said you weren't thrilled about him being gone so long." He handed me a glass of deep red wine. "He was worried about you." Something warm bloomed in my chest at the thought of Mark talking about me, caring about me, even from a distance. We settled on the couch, a comfortable distance between us, and talked, really talked. Not the surface-level conversations we'd always had at group gatherings, but deeper discussions about books we loved, places we wanted to travel, dreams we hadn't quite given up on. John was funny in a quiet, thoughtful way that was different from Mark's more boisterous humor. He listened intently when I spoke. His eyes, a striking hazel I'd never really noticed before, focused entirely on me. "You know," he said, refilling our glasses, "I've known you for 3 years now? And I feel like I'm just meeting you for the first time." The wine had loosened something in me, made the apartment feel less empty. I was just thinking the same thing. When John finally left around midnight, I found myself standing at the window, watching him walk to his car. There was a lightness in my step as I cleaned up our glasses, a humming energy that had been absent since Mark left. I told myself it was just the relief of human connection after days of solitude. Nothing more. But when my phone chimed with a text from John the next morning, "Had fun last night? Wanna grab dinner tonight?" the flutter in my stomach told a different story. I stared at John's text for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. There was nothing inherently wrong with having dinner with my husband's best friend while he was away. It was thoughtful, even. Mark would probably appreciate John checking in on me. So why did it feel like I was about to step over an invisible line? "Sure, that sounds great," I finally replied, adding a casual smiley face that took me 3 attempts to decide on. We met at a small Italian place downtown, the kind of intimate restaurant with low lighting and candles on the tables. Not the kind of place friends casually meet for dinner. John looked different outside the context of our apartment, more polished in his blue button-down shirt, his dark hair slightly tousled in a way that seemed both careless and deliberate. "You look nice," he said, as I slid into the booth across from him. The compliment shouldn't have made my cheeks warm, but it did. The conversation flowed as easily as it had the night before, but there was an undercurrent now, a tension that hadn't been there before. I found myself laughing too loudly at his jokes, touching my hair too often, aware of every accidental brush of our hands when we both reached for the breadbasket. "How's Mark doing with his presentation?" John asked as we shared a tiramisu. The mention of my husband's name sent a jolt of guilt through me. I'd been so caught up in the evening that I'd missed his call. My phone showed a text. "Call when you can. Love you." "He's good," I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Busy." John nodded, studying my face with an intensity that made me look away. "You miss him." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Of course I do." Later, as we stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, an awkward silence fell between us. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and possibility. "I should get home," I said, not moving. John took a step closer. "Sarah." The way he said my name made something shift inside me. I looked up at him, at the face I'd seen countless times but was somehow seeing anew. "This is a bad idea," I whispered, but I didn't step back. "I know," he replied, his voice rough. "I've been telling myself that for 3 years." The confession hung in the air between us, changing everything. 3 years, since the day we met, since before Mark and I were married. I called a rideshare instead of letting him drive me home. As I watched his figure grow smaller in the rear window, I called Mark, desperate to hear his voice, to anchor myself to the life I'd chosen. "Hey, babe," he answered, sounding tired but happy. "I missed you earlier." "I miss you," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "Come home soon." The next morning, I woke to a text from John. "We need to talk about last night." My stomach dropped. Nothing had happened, not physically, but something had definitely changed. A door had been opened that should have remained firmly shut. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop, somewhere public and safe. The kind of place where nothing inappropriate could happen. He was already there when I arrived, 2 cups on the table in front of him. He'd remembered how I take my coffee, oat milk, no sugar. It shouldn't have affected me, but it did. "I'm sorry," he said before I'd even sat down. "What I said last night was out of line." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to focus on besides his face. "We should probably just forget it happened." "Is that what you want?" The question hung between us. Was it what I wanted? The truth was messier than I cared to admit. "What I want doesn't matter," I finally said. "I love Mark. He's my husband. You're his best friend." John nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're right. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Mark that it made my chest ache. "I needed you to know. I've been carrying it for so long." "Why now?" I asked, the question that had been burning in me since last night. "Because when I saw you alone in your apartment, looking so beautiful even in sweatpants with tea stains, something just broke in me." His honesty was disarming. "I've been so careful for so long, Sarah. Always keeping the right distance. Always being the good friend." I understood then that he had been fighting this battle much longer than I had, carrying feelings he never acted on out of loyalty to Mark. "I should go," I said, standing abruptly. "Mark comes home tomorrow." John nodded, not trying to stop me. "For what it's worth, he's lucky. I've always thought so." I walked home instead of taking the bus, needing the time to clear my head. The city moved around me in its usual rhythm, people rushing to meetings, couples holding hands, life continuing as if my world hadn't just tilted on its axis. By the time I reached our apartment, I'd made my decision. I pulled out my phone and blocked John's number. It was drastic, perhaps even cowardly, but necessary. Some temptations were too dangerous to leave doors open. That night, I cleaned the apartment thoroughly, erasing any trace of the past few days. I changed the sheets, bought fresh flowers, prepared Mark's favorite meal for when he'd return. As I moved through our home, I felt both loss and relief. Something had ended before it truly began, a possibility, a path not taken. Mark's flight landed at 2:15 p.m. I tracked it obsessively on my phone, watching the little airplane icon inch closer to home. When he finally emerged from the arrivals gate, looking tired but happy, the sight of him hit me with unexpected force. This was my choice. This was my life. This man with his kind eyes and easy smile, who knew me better than anyone. "God, I missed you," he said, wrapping me in a bear hug that lifted me off my feet. On the drive home, he talked excitedly about his trip, the successful presentation, the connections he'd made. I listened, soaking in the familiar cadence of his voice. "How about you?" he asked as we pulled into our parking space. "What did you do while I was gone? Anything exciting?" The question was innocent, but it made my heart race. "Nothing much," I said, focusing on unbuckling my seatbelt. "Caught up on work, watched some shows." "John mentioned he stopped by," Mark said casually. "Said he brought wine." I froze, then forced myself to relax. Of course John would have mentioned it to Mark. There was nothing suspicious about that visit, viewed from the outside. "Yeah, that was nice of him," I said, aiming for nonchalance. "We just talked for a bit." Mark nodded, grabbing his suitcase from the trunk. "He's a good guy. I'm glad you weren't completely alone the whole time." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. That night, as Mark slept beside me, jet-lagged and exhausted, I stared at the ceiling and thought about choices, about parallel lives that branch off from single moments of decision, about the woman I might have become if I'd made different choices. I thought about John, too, and hoped he would find someone who could love him the way he deserved. Someone who wasn't married to his best friend. In the morning, I woke to Mark's arm draped over me, his breath warm against my neck. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, and somewhere in the building, someone was playing soft jazz. "Morning," Mark mumbled, pulling me closer. "What are you thinking about? You look serious." I turned to face him, taking in the familiar features I'd committed to memory years ago. "Just that I'm glad you're home." It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. Some truths are complicated, layered with what-ifs and might-have-beens. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I'd made the right choice. The temptation had been real. The feelings, whatever they were, had been real too. But they were a flash fire, intense and consuming, and ultimately unsustainable. What Mark and I had was different. It was a slow burn, steady and warming. It was the kind of love that could weather absences and temptations and come out stronger on the other side. As I leaned in to kiss him, I silently said goodbye to the road not taken. Some boundaries, once recognized, become easier to respect. And some choices, once made, need to be made again every day.